So let's start our webinar. Dear friends and colleagues, welcome to our third webinar on climate change and energy security issues for NATO nations. It's now the second half of the webinar that is more dedicated directly to armed forces, and today's webinar will be revolving around the strategy and doctrines from NATO and from the armed forces in addressing these strategic issues. Just to sum up the two previous webinars, and especially the second on the different challenges in the neighborhood of NATO about the Arctic, MENA and Africa. The lessons learned were that all of this region will be affected by climate change very differently, sometimes with new challenges, even with opportunities, depending, for example, in the Arctic on maritime trade. Yet the armed forces are going to be forced to think about climate change, to think about the way to address these issues. Yet in addressing these issues, in terms of missions, in terms of equipments, in terms of global challenges, there is one thing to keep in mind is that no new challenge, including climate change, could be addressed with hampering operational efficiency, because armed forces are still made to maintain peace and to conduct military operations. So today it will be very interesting, and thanks again to all of our speakers for their will to share their insights on this issue. It will be to them to explain us how it could be addressed in order to keep in mind the role, traditional role of the armed forces, but to cope with these new challenges. Romualdas Petkevicius, the director from NSEC CRE, our partner in organizing this series webinar, will be the moderator. So Romualdas, the floor is yours. Thank you, and thanks to all our speakers again. You're muted still, Romualdas.
Okay, now everybody can hear me. We never learn, you know, how many, almost a year we've been living remotely, and still this "you're muted" is the most common phrase. But good morning and good afternoon, everybody. First of all, greetings to our panelists, but also to the members of the audience who join us. Thank you, Nicolas, for your review of the previous webinars. And today is very important webinar and very close to our hearts. After those two previous webinars, which were concentrated on more maybe strategic and global issues related to the climate change, today we're going to dive deeper into details as what the military can expect from the climate change, what consequences it might have for the military, and the most important question: is military prepared to address the issues of the climate change, or should military care at all? You know, maybe those issues will go away and will survive. So I'm looking forward to interesting discussion. We had the keynote speech scheduled from retired Lieutenant General Richard Nugee from UK, who basically handles climate-related issues for the Ministry of Defense of United Kingdom. We'll try to get connected to him. There are technical issues. So in order to save time, we will push the keynote maybe to the end of our webinar, or we will see, maybe we'll insert it after one of the panelists. But I would like, despite that, we have a great range of panelists here representing both NATO organization, representing some national views. Also, we have our own expert here from this center representing more of the think tank approach, how the military can be addressing military issues. So I'm very happy to introduce our good friend, General Didier Polomé, who is Assistant Chief of Staff for plans and from Strategic Plans and Policy in Allied Command Transformation based in Norfolk. As I mentioned, as we've talked briefly before the session, he is fellow Air Force officer and probably guilty of the climate change as I am. I'm also Air Force officer. Apparently, Air Force is the most biggest pollutant. So for that, General was holding a lot of flying. He is a pilot himself. He was holding a lot of flying positions at the beginning of this career. Then he was in the leadership and command positions. And I guess to redeem from his sins of polluting, he was sent to Allied Command Transformation, and he has energy efficiency and probably climate change in his portfolio. So we'll be happy to hear from you. General, we also have Mrs. Sherri Goodman. She is a very experienced climate change expert from United States. Unfortunately, she's not yet connected, but hopefully she'll be connected later.
I'm here.
You are here. Wow, Sherri, nice to see you. Sorry, I didn't see you on my screen, but it's my pleasure to introduce you. I was reading that you have experience working as a staff member on Armed Services Committee, as well as on the DoD staff as well, dealing with energy and climate change. So we really value your point, especially specifically as far as operational energy goes. United States military was first in recognizing the issue of energy efficiency, and we hope that United States will continue in lead with this approach to the climate change. So we'll be happy to hear from you also during our discussions. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Zimmermann, who is here, works at the Energy Security Center of Excellence. He's leading Research and Lessons Learned Division. He's not only Dr. Zimmermann, he is also Colonel Zimmermann, so very experienced researcher and scholar, still does some teaching and research and activities in different research institutions around the globe, I would say, both in Germany and in Latin America. So we are happy to have him here working at the center. So we'll be happy to hear what he has to say. And last but not least will be General Schonewille, who is from Netherlands. And I was reading short bio, and I understand the general has a great experience in logistics related issues, both with the life cycle management and logistics support of armed forces. So it will be interesting to hear national perspective again, as we will be able to compare from what US has to say, United Kingdom, and then Netherlands. So we will be happy to hear from the general as well. So we'll, if you don't mind, we'll proceed in the order I introduced the speakers. I'll give everybody to do the introductory remarks. Please try to keep them up to maybe 10 minutes. If we go a little bit overboard, it's not a big deal. As I said, I am Air Force officer. Flexibility is the key to air power, so we'll survive if we go a little bit overboard. We'll try to finish maybe in the hour and a half, 2 hours this webinar. For those in the audience, you have the opportunity to ask questions or interact with us using question and answer option on the Zoom platform. I'll ask Nicolas to help me to manage the questions, so we can get some questions from the audience. I also have my own questions, which I use privilege as a moderator to ask our panelists. So without, and all the recordings of the webinars will be available both on the sites of our French partners and on the site of NATO and SecCOE, so you can refer to those later if you wish to. So without further ado, General Polomé will be happy to hear from you first.
First, thank you very much, Nicolas, for organizing this webinar, and Romualdas for inviting me to speak. Do you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. The connection.
Okay, very well. And
General,
also,
General, sorry
thank
if
you
I
for
can
this
interrupt.
provocative introduction. This very important topic, but of course, I take the challenge. So let me give you or read you a few notes that I have prepared here with some of my collaborators in Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, and that gives you an idea on where we are with energy security and the relation with climate change into our thinking at this headquarters. So nowadays, the overarching energy context is shaped by the worldwide competition for access to energy resources. In that perspective, energy could be considered as an area of operation where peer competitors operate to seize the advantage. The competition for resources is amplified by the effect of climate change on access of new resources, for instance, in the Arctic region. With energy use comes the negative impacts on climate change. Climate-related threats will create stress on the global socio-economic system and may also degrade the conditions for security. Stressors resulting from migration, energy competition, infrastructure fragility, and regional competition over food and water security could serve as a catalyst for tensions and possibly lead to conflicts. For NATO, energy security means providing energy supply to NATO forces in all conditions, including in areas affected by climate change. Energy security includes the protection of energy infrastructures against all threats, including cyber threats. Energy security is part of the resilience equation. Looking to the future, it is pivotal to prepare NATO forces to face the challenges posed by climate change and energy security together. NATO forces will have to improve energy efficiency and carefully plan for a transition from traditional fossil fuel to innovative and sustainable energy supplies. While offsetting the consequences of energy use, the transition will need to be synchronized among the alliance, with the EU, and with the energy sector to maintain the essential availability and sustainability for operations. We will need to adapt and prepare the forces to enhance our future freedom to operate. Mastering energy security becomes essential. In this context, ACT has the responsibility to anticipate and guide the transformation of the Alliance through its warfare development activities. I will propose you a few considerations on how ACT and ANZAC COE can support the transformation while integrating factors of climate change and ANZAC under the following three sets of activities. First would be raising the strategic awareness. We say scan, investigate, and inform. Two will be driving the doctrine, standards, and innovation. Three, planning the delivering of capabilities. And this will be the structure of my notes. First, raising the strategic awareness. It is fundamental preliminary steps to take up the challenges in the field of climate changes and ANZAC. It aims at changing the mindset to prepare the future. We need to think the unthinkable and prepare for it. Raising the strategic awareness can be supported by the best military strategic thinking to include resilience, climate change, and energy security. In that regard, ACT has already provided valuable products such as the recent NATO Warfighting Capstone Concept, or NWCC, or developed the first version of the Associated Warfare Development Agenda, also named WDA. ACT also provides a continuous process of strategic foresight analysis. Let me mention to your attention the SFA report on Russia, recently issued at the beginning of this year, the SFA report on the Arctic and the High North, currently under development. Moreover, with the alliance, we also observe that nations are adopting defense energy strategies, such as UK, Germany, France, Canada, and USA. Those nations stated the willingness to address climate change impacts by developing energy transition, increasing energy resilience, and modeling proactive behavior, all important in a multinational cooperation framework. I cannot forget to emphasize the pivotal role played by the NATO NSEC COE in this field of interest as well. The NSEC COE expertise offers significant leverage of strategic awareness, thanks to its great works in the scope of strategic analysis, research and lessons learned, education, training and experimentations, doctrine and concept development. In particular, the support of expertise of the NSEC COE is paramount about critical energy infrastructure protection and energy efficiency in the militaries, hybridization of combat assets, smart grid for power generation, all subjects that you might hear more about today from Reiner. In addition, the NATO 230 document, Unified for a New Era, highlights that the alliance should increase its situational awareness by sharing of intelligence and exchanges with experts on energy development and support the protection of critical energy infrastructure. The document points out also that NATO emphasis should be on the nexus of climate change and security and on ensuring that efforts to address climate change bolster rather than undercut military readiness and capabilities. It means participating to reduce environmental footprint without hampering operational effectiveness. The second point is driving the doctrine, standards, and innovation. It will allow NATO to manage the energy transitions of forces, adapting concepts and doctrines related to energy distribution to forces in operation has become one of the ACT focuses in the short term. To that end, ACT has requested the assistance of the NSEC COE to develop a NATO operational energy concept in order to provide the conceptual framework to prepare the future logistical capabilities. This concept is to foster cooperation between nations and to develop synergies. Doing so, we seek to implement joint solutions and common standards to improve interoperability while preserving operational effectiveness. The concept is going to propose a federated conceptual document for nations. It is to promote an overarching approach on operational energy. It is also to share a common view related to the main energy-related stakes from a military point of view. Of course, this concept should assess advantages and drawbacks of the use of alternative energies in the military. In addition, ACT is fostering innovation to maintain the competitive edge for NATO. For instance, ACT is monitoring and investigating the current developments of new energy technologies that we expect to force the forces to adopt in the forthcoming years, such as implementing new energy sources and resilient grid technology. This task is part of the preparedness to tackle climate change impacts and reinforce energy security. New sources of energy, such as electrofuels, biofuels, and hydrogen produce renewable sources of energy very in the future, as they are environmental friendly. Moreover, contribute to NSEC by ensuring diversity of sources, since these fuels are produced from various primary energy sources. They contribute also to NSEC by reducing dependencies to NATO external energy suppliers, as these fuels can be industrially produced within NATO nations. E-fuels, biofuels, and hydrogen will enable a higher mix of renewables. These alternative fuels could also be coupled to hybrid combat assets through the use of batteries, where it does not jeopardize the combat effectiveness. So that is, for us as military planners, the mandatory conditions, of course. To ensure responsiveness through interoperability, these new fuels are to be standardized across the NATO nations. In this domain, once again, the support of the NSEC COE is paramount, since the COE is conducting experimentations related to energy generation and energy management. Above all, the innovative energy solutions for military applications show, organized by the COE, is a diamond event in terms of innovation. Third point, planning and delivering capabilities. It will guarantee us to preserve the edge of NATO military instrument of power over our potential adversaries in the context of climate change and NSEC. We plan and deliver the combat capabilities in line with these challenges. The NDPP process and the new government model for common funded capabilities delivery take into account the imperative of NSEC. We seek to provide energy supply related capabilities, contributing to a reliable energy supply chain in operations. During the planning process, the main principle is to strengthen the military capabilities to face any climate-related threats without hampering operational effectiveness. In fact, we need to avoid any energy shortage in the militaries, including in at the end of the day, to build up a strong military resilience in the field for innovation in logistics. More broadly, new capabilities must meet the requirements to buffer the shock of big weather events and to avoid any operational disruptions in the new environment shaped by climate change. To that end, the collaboration with the industrial and private sector is essential to design new capabilities. The cooperation with the EU, both at the strategic and operational levels, is another critical factor of success. Simultaneously, in case of big climate events and in the framework of resilience, NATO forces may face a supplemental change in addition to their primary role, which is to intervene in support of civilian sectors. This is part of the civil-military approach described in the NBCC and being developed more in details in the new WDA. The use of collective and multinational solutions for energy supply is also essential. The new idea of NATO modular combined energy management capability must be developed in order to offer a more capable and interoperable joint logistic capability. This idea is based on the current and concrete example of modular combined petroleum unit capability already included in the NDPP planning process. To conclude, in regard of the three main preparedness aspects discussed previously, raising the strategic awareness helps to anticipate the future energy requirements while tackling the impact of climate change. The NATO NSEC COE and the strategic foresight analysis branches here in ACT are great enablers in this domain. Driving the concept, doctrine, and innovation is on the way, including the paramount NATO operational energy concept to be developed in the forthcoming months. In the context of warfare development, such a concept is an essential prerequisite for rallying nations on the development of standards related to the energy transition for the deployed forces. Regarding capability delivery, we will meet the challenges of innovation and interoperability of the future energy military systems in close coordination with the industrial and private partners, synchronizing the transition across the allies and with the EU. Without any doubt, new sources of energy should not hinder but enhance capabilities of new combat assets, increase mobility, extend the range, and develop autonomy. By doing so, NATO can maintain its freedom to operate in the future, ensure the alliance can outfight adversaries, and fulfill its core tasks as described in a NATO military strategy. Overall, the energy transition of forces in the context of green defense and climate change must remain an operational advantage. Hybrid system and new liquid fuels produced from renewable energy sources represent the most relevant alternatives in the medium term to contribute to a smooth transition of logistical combat capabilities. In the long term, hydrogen, providing a high degree of interoperability, may also play an important role in the transformation of military towards a carbon neutral energy solution. I hope this presentation provided you a few elements to better understand the level of preparedness of the Alliance regarding climate change and energy security. With this, I hope I wasn't too long, and I give you back the floor.
Thank you, General. Very impressive overview of where NATO stands, both on energy security and energy efficiency, but also on the climate change. And if you don't mind, since I have you still here, because we have some connection issues, we lost your video, but we improved audio. I still would like to ask the follow-on a little bit, you know, because we have a few nations represented here. And what nations might expect in terms of climate change or energy efficiency through the NATO defense planning process, let's say in the upcoming few cycles of the defense planning? What NATO has in store for nations in that respect?
Okay, so I need to put the NDPP back into perspective to be able to answer the question. So in the NDPP process, planning new capabilities or planning capabilities for the alliance is a well-known process within NATO to synchronize the warfare development and the capability development of capability planning of the 30 allies, to make sure that we have one set of force that is compatible, that is interoperable, and that can be commanded with the appropriate echelons and the appropriate capabilities. That is very important to understand. So moving this fast is not an option. So for NATO, what would be expected if new policies are in place, including energy-related and climate-related policies, that it will have an impact, and it will be a progressive impact, because first of all, the NDPP produce capabilities, and we have to be effective into our mission, defensive missions. We have core tasks, we cannot deviate from it. So what will change is that more and more, the requirements to the nations will be driven by effects rather than pure material or equipment. So, and I'm hearing this almost every day into NATO. So at the end, we need to achieve effects, which are kinetic, and they are also virtual and cognitive effects. I mean, this is a mix of effects, but we have effects to achieve, and more, and the NDPP does that, allows the flexibility for nations to propose assets that will meet these effects in an effective way. So that's really how to answer this. We will not drive the energy transition. Nations will probably do, or even the EU, if they push their own nations that are part of NATO to do an energy transition, it will have an impact on NATO planning as well. And we are ready to embrace that, as long as the desired effects are achieved to achieve our mission.
Thank you. That was clear. That was clear, and it's nice to hear that NATO is expecting nations to drive the kind of transformation in the area of energy and renewables. And I see that we have General Nugee connected, and I understand, General, you agreed to wait until the end of the panelist presentations with your keynote, or you prefer to speak now? Because I was not aware if you were planning to stay with us through all the meeting.
Yes, I'm very happy to stay. I hope you can hear me okay and see me okay now. Real apologies. I've had to drive to the top of the nearest hill to get decent connectivity, hence I'm in my car, so apologies for that. I'm very happy to wait if you want to to have the panelists brief first, and then I will come in after that, if that is what you would prefer.
Okay, thank you, General. Then we'll ask the panelists to speak, and then you will have the more food for thought to summarize and provide UK perspectives, since you are providing advice to all Ministry of Defense of UK on climate. You will be very well placed after that. So, Sherri, we would like to hear from you, since you now hold the position of Secretary General for International Military Council on Climate Change. It would be interesting to hear how United States approaches the question. In what trouble United States military is as far as the climate change goes.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you for this NATO gathering. I should note that I actually started my career at NATO's North Atlantic Assembly. I actually think I see Simon Lunn on the line. I was there many moons ago when I was just getting started, but I learned so much working at NATO. I've always had a great fondness for NATO. Now, as was said in the introduction, I also worked on the Senate Armed Services Committee when Senator Nunn was chairman, and I spent 8 years as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. So essentially the Chief Environment, Safety, Health, Energy Officer for the Department of Defense in the 1990s from 1993 to 2001. And we did a lot with NATO in those early post-Cold War years, and certainly then through the Committee on the Challenges of a Modern Society, which has another title now. But we were first exploring global environmental issues and developing green ship concepts as well within NATO. I then founded a military advisory board at the Center for Naval Analysis, which characterized climate change as a threat multiplier for the first time in 2007. And that's been a frame that's been used, including by NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg and John Kerry and many others, to frame the challenge that we face of climate change as a threat multiplier. And indeed, I think that's a good way for NATO to see that, understand that now as well. In the International Military Council on Climate Security, which I lead along with former Dutch Chief of Defense Tom Mittendorp, I'm sure known to a number of you, we have now over 35 nations included, former military, national security professionals, active serving civilian and military officers, to raise awareness on climate change and operational energy issues as relevant to this era. And we're very pleased that we're working very closely with General Nugee in the lead up to COP26 to put climate security and energy issues onto that agenda as appropriate, because our militaries, of course, are so important, and because they are leaders, users of energy, and leaders in the transformation of energy. So let me just share with you a few thoughts about how I think about this. And I recently wrote a piece for a NATO journal with a co-author, my co-author, Aaron Sikorsky, on NATO and climate change. So let me just put in the context kind of how it's useful, I think, for NATO to think about the climate challenges, and then how we're going to deal with that, particularly in terms of operational energy, the focus of this conference. And let me thank all of you who work at NATO in its various dimensions in addressing this, because I think you're really at the forefront of what is the greatest global challenge, at really an existential risk. So there are 4 areas of particularly acute risk for NATO, I think, which is that climate change is increasing the demand for humanitarian assistance and disaster recovery missions, or what we call HADR. I mean, it used to be, when I was started in this business, we said that HADR was not a force sizing concept. We were going to fight 2 major regional conflicts. But increasingly, we found that our forces are deployed for either natural disaster missions at home in the United States, from Hurricane Katrina to the hurricanes and floods of 2019, to responding to flooding across Europe in Ukraine, Romania, and Hungary. So increasingly, this HADR support is likely to expand as climate change-induced extreme weather events like intense floods, storms, droughts, heat wave increase in coming years. And then overlaying these events with socio-political developments, including increased population density along coastal areas, complex crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's unsurprising human and financial costs of these disasters continues to grow. And they're not relegated to the developing world, because the insurance company Munich Re has found that mortality risk related to heat waves is rising in Europe as the frequency, duration, and intensity of heat waves increase and resistance decreases due to aging societies. Okay, second, climate change negatively impacts military readiness and operations. We see this already, extreme heat, extreme weather events, really having an impact on our military, NATO military bases and infrastructure, also straining troops and equipment when operating abroad. Installations along the Mediterranean and Atlantic are particularly vulnerable, and the missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Sub-Saharan Africa already face climate risk regularly. Sea level rise and extreme weather events are the most concerning. Third, we know that climate change effects exacerbate state fragility. There's a direct overlap between fragile states and climate risk. Rising temperatures and increases in drought and flooding contribute to irregular migration, public discontent with government services, and contests over increasingly scarce food and water resources, that race for resources. And these challenges are most pronounced in states and regions already suffering from poor governance practices and environmental degradation. And even though climate change alone doesn't cause instability, its spillover into armed conflict could spur external migration, which have consequences for NATO's missions. And then fourth, climate change contributing to geopolitical competition. I mean, the obvious case here is the Arctic. A whole new ocean has opened in our lifetime. In the early post-Cold War period, I worked directly with Russia and many of our NATO partners, particularly Norway, in a program called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation to help Russia build down and properly store liquid waste streams from decommissioned nuclear submarines. Now we have a whole new ocean that's open. Russia's remilitarizing in the Arctic. We need increased capabilities. We've seen increased GPS jamming and Russian activity close to interfering with our own NATO exercises. We've got Chinese ambitions in the Arctic. So that's one way, and that's occurred because of retreating sea ice, rising temperatures, and thawing and collapsing permafrost. Okay, so now, you know, what do we need to do about it? Well, I want to talk about the three ways with a focus particularly on the energy piece because of the nature of this conference. But really, the first is that the Alliance needs to build what I'm going to call climate domain awareness. Now, General Polomé talked about the strategic awareness, raising strategic awareness, which I know is part of, you know, the new NATO concept on climate change that the Secretary General has articulated. And I think in this particular area, we need to have that foresight, that improved predictive capability to understand how to operate in this less predictable, because of climate change environment. The knowledge about the nexus of climate change and security risks is going to be increasingly important. And so we need this climate domain awareness in the same way we think about domain awareness for cyber, for the maritime environment. And this is going to be increasingly strategically important to us. I had the privilege of participating in the strategic foresight exercise that NATO conducted in Norway about the Arctic a couple of years ago. And I think these are really important. It's partly a qualitative exercise, but there's going to be increasingly improved quantitative data science activities that help us move beyond the short-term weather forecast into what's called either extended weather or shorter-term climate prediction that has operational relevance to NATO's military planning. And in that regard, thinking about how a climate security center of excellence could work together either with NATO's energy security center that already exists or in parallel that would help to collect and as appropriate centralize NATO's climate-related methodological and oceanographic data collection and develop best practices that can be integrated across allied countries. We're going to need that for operational purposes. Second, NATO should prioritize the development of climate resilient infrastructure. And I'm so glad that ACT Norfolk is taking a lead on this. I've had a chance to talk with some of the leaders down there. And I think that as the Alliance better understands the climate security threat, it's also got to take action to build resilience of NATO bases and operations, help member states adapt their military security and critical civilian infrastructure to withstand climate effects that are coming in the near term, regardless of future emissions trajectories. These initiatives could include low carbon footprint projects designed to significantly lower the scale and scope of climate change, bolstering security and creating long-lasting employment opportunities. And importantly, this activity must stretch beyond the borders of NATO states. NATO should leverage its expertise to help developing countries outside the alliance build resilience and adapt to climate risk These could be incorporated into training missions and other engagements with the goal of promoting regular mill-to-mill and civil mill international engagement on climate change preparation. Not only would this enhance the resilience of these NATO countries and potentially prevent, and prevent climate security risks that could spill over as threats to NATO. It could enhance NATO's influence in strategic areas. Okay, finally, let's talk about the operational energy dimension. And, you know, we learned so much in the unfortunate deployments. Well, we learned so much over the decades of deployments we had in Afghanistan and Iraq about the logistics burden of providing energy and water, in particular, to forward operating bases, because they were a drag on the logistics tail. So the tail was really wagging the tooth, and we put so many soldiers and Marines and others at risk trucking fuel and water to the front, particularly in those remote locations. And so that innovation in operational energy has begun already over a decade ago. And I think that needs to really continue now that we have the urgency of the climate crisis upon us. Part of that is going to be in how we power our forward operating logistics bases, everything from better insulation and alternative fuel, renewable fuels to power the forward operating base, to what those liquid fuels are that power our forces at the front. And then when we get to liquid fuels, particularly for aircraft, and I'm glad we have so many Air Force officers on here, you guys are really going to be leading the way. I sometimes think, okay, what is going to be the next JP8? Okay, what is going to be that standardized fuel? We have to figure out not only what those alternatives are in terms of those new liquid fuels, but how to standardize and make them interoperable among our forces. That's going to be a next big NATO challenge for all our forces. Third, we've got the issue that as we move towards more renewables, we also are more dependent on critical minerals and rare earths. So we're going to have to think about how to address that issue, because otherwise we create additional vulnerabilities as we move towards renewables. And that might mean either developing more sustainable mining practices in countries that, in allied or partner countries that can source those materials. And then finally looking at the supply chains, not only for these materials, that's going to be an important piece, but also the global supply chains overall for energy, and how those supply chains can potentially create weaknesses. Finally, I'd say on the operational energy, we need to use the power of our science and technology. You know, all of our nations, NATO and all of our individual nations have great science and technology innovation, many different labs, all working for our individual countries, but also partner together. We need to figure out the right ways to marry that together. So what's developed out of the Department of Energy labs and the defense labs in the United States also benefits our NATO alliance. And then finally, we need to think about how the buying power of the military, the buying power of our military really can help in this regard, because we know that overall innovation has led to great changes. In military innovation has given us GPS and the internet. And so what's the next innovation that's going to come out of the military sector? Or if it doesn't come out of our own labs, our buying power to use it, either those new fuels, those new renewables, those new climate predictive capabilities as well, to see over the horizon, are going to help usher in a new generation of technology that's going to improve the lives of many and help us all develop a more climate resilient world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherri, Ms. Goodman. It's very impressive. Climate change domain, huh? That's very good. Alongside with the cyber and space, we're right there. But listen, I was listening to when you kind of started from climate change as the threat multiplier, and then listened the how it might happen, and it reminded me the first webinar, you know, that we have in this climate change domain with some civilian audience, and one reference was made because the kind of threat will, because of the climate change, the threat will kind of, future threats might change as well. As you said, more maybe humanitarian operations and everything. So the proposal was made, maybe military should also transform to be more kind of ready to address those humanitarian type of missions instead of those kind of general threat missions. Are you not afraid of that military will have to change too much and losing its core capability to defend the nation from the traditional threats into organization to address kind of humanitarian threats of the humanitarian nation? Is not the danger?
Well, I think that, you know, we need to understand that the militaries are a reflection of the societies in which we live. I think many of these, whether it's the pandemic response or response to a natural disaster, should in the first instance be led by civilian organizations. That's why we have civilian control of the military, but there's, given all the capabilities from logistics and supply to lift to medical, now to growing environmental and energy capabilities, I think our militaries can serve as great reach back and support capabilities to support those civilian first responders. Also, there's no doubt that when we have deployed our forces to perform HADR missions around the world, I think of the Navy medical ships that came in after the Indonesian tsunami a number of years ago. Not only did that provide relief after just a devastating natural disaster to so many, but it helped strengthen our alliances and our partnerships globally. So when we have so much of the world in so much need, I think we have to understand how NATO, not substituting for what should be civilian-led activities, but using its very powerful capability in reserve when called upon, and not to take away from the need to continue to be able to perform those essential missions vis-a-vis, for example, continuing Russian aggression or Chinese ambitions throughout not only the Asia Pacific, but other parts of the world, and stand for its core values of democracy and a world that is whole and free. So I think this is, to me, it's all part of what NATO stands for. How it uses its capabilities in any particular instance needs to be a strategic judgment at the highest levels.
Thank you very much. That's very reassuring answer and reassuring approach. That's what we hope to hear here in the military, that we still maintain our capabilities to where we perceive them most required. Okay, now we'll switch to our local here to Dr. Zimmermann, Reiner. You're going to talk about renewables and the military, and Mrs. Goodman was talking about that's in the future. That's in the future for the military. We need to look for the new sources of energy, to be prepared to even address the challenges related to the rare earth materials where they have to be obtained. So how are doing in that, Reiner? Please, floor is yours now.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss with you the topics. I will add on a little bit on key challenges in transition to resilience and the impact on military capabilities. Actually, I must say most has been already said, and I thank you very much, Sherri and General Polomé. I think that was pretty substantial. So some of it might be a little bit of repetition, but let's first clarify a few points from my perspective. First is challenges to NATO armed forces are, of course, from the climate change, direct and indirect threats. And they emerge typically from the need for adaptation or mitigation. Mitigation is basically prevention of further negative impacts. They have been extensively discussed already. I'll focus a little bit on the energy security issues, which may arise from climate change for the military. And these are four groups really of topics. Two of them I will not touch very much because they have been treated already. These are direct effects, infrastructure damages, changes in human performance and health. And the other topic is geopolitical aspects like trade routes changing and access to new energy resources. Let me focus a little bit on the social and political aspects of climate change, which are indirect. And that's regional conflicts, migration, and national and international obligations. And the other group is basically the technological aspects. There's quite a hype about renewable energy production, new fuel types used, technology changes, and of course, the issue of cybersecurity. These topics are all closely connected, but I think there might be a little bit sometimes of too much optimism. What's in for the military here? I also would like to stress that NATO armed forces have the job of a transition to resilience. So the commitment to resilience in terms of energy security with respect to effects from climate change were clearly expressed during the Warsaw Summit. And resilience in the context of climate change and energy security is really the ability of the NATO armed forces to resist negative impacts. We have heard about that quite a bit, but also to regain structural functionality after any sort of disturbance. And I think that's the soft spot still. Then energy resilience actually means much more than just adaptation to climate change induced damages or the mitigation. That has been covered already. It actually requires preparedness and clear recovery planning. And it also requires a very clear perspective of the military forces on what the timeline for these recoveries should be. It's not enough just to be able to recover. It's also important to recover very fast for most military forces. So before we look a little bit at the key challenges and only two of the topics mainly, I would like the other presenters before me, would like to stress the fact that NATO armed forces are following. They are not driving the processes of decision-making on neither energy security, really technology, or the tasks demanded from them. That comes from political decisions. And so armed forces are really trailing. They need to adapt to technology and budgetary realities and limitations. They depend on the material they get and the budget. This, however, does not relieve military in general in NATO, especially the military leaders and the decision makers, from the responsibility to closely follow emerging challenges, and some of them are unknown, and to remain a very active role in reporting, advising, and demanding support from government and society for the tasks. So there are limitations for armed forces to respond and react to climate change, and they arise from those limits I mentioned before. Keeping in mind those limitations, let's have a look at the challenges mentioned before. And I will focus on politics and society and technology and give just a few examples. There are, for societal and political aspects, international disaster reliefs and migration issues, and they have been mentioned already. Famine and international human relief missions definitely will increase. Think about the sub-Sahel. So the stress on military forces will be, or the demand on NATO forces will most likely go up. And migration, especially in the MENA region, in the Mediterranean and North African region, will probably be the most important topic for us. And that ties in with energy. I will explain it in a second. Just consider Africa will quadruple in population until 2100. Nigeria alone will be larger than the United States and Russia together in population. They will need all the resources, energy resources as well as other ones, and they most likely will export human labor and will also suffer from internal social and political unrest. And they will be the breeding ground for extremism, as we see already. And it all happens in an area which will be of utmost importance in the light of new energies and renewable energies. I will comment on that in a second. The other big point, the other big challenge certainly is national disaster relief operations. I just give the example of Australia, where the droughts and wildfires, evacuation and fire control has basically brought the defense forces to the limit so that their capability of defense was already compromised. And then we have these international and national political obligations, not to forget. These are challenges. The demand for peacekeeping missions in an international frame will certainly remain the same or go up. But most important, I think, is that the decarbonization goals which were set internationally, and which will be now, to one or the other extent, be followed by nations, at least in NATO nations, they will seriously affect the military forces. And I will comment on that in the next group of topics, which is technological aspects of climate change, of indirect effects. So there are two big groups of topics. The one is the changes in fuel type and the energy used, and the associated technologies which will be used. Everybody's talking about that. If you go for synthetic fuels and even carbon-free fuels like hydrogen or nitrogen from a renewable energy source, and that's the political objective, and you also try to go for direct carbon capture, this will lead to significant changes in propulsion technologies in transport, storage, distribution, and handling. And that requires, that number one, that's driven by the civil sector. Don't get confused. I mean, the military does not have its own energy resources per se. For the military, it requires definitely, if it's going to happen, a lot of retraining of personnel or new training of personnel. And it will create, and that's most important, significant new dependencies and threats for the military. Just consider if we have to move to more electrification in the forces, whether it's for fixed installations or for mobility, and it's driven by civil developments for the military. That means the military gets more and more dependent on the civil grid. And we all know that electricity has only limited storage options. So the military's capabilities will be, I would say, compromised to some degree by these new developments. Don't look at it too optimistic for the military. The other big group is then renewable energy production, because where will it happen? It was mentioned already before, renewable energy production, may it be a shift to solar thermal, or solar photovoltaic, or to hydrogen, or even to geothermal energy sources. They will inevitably lead to significant shifts in geographic location of energy production sites. And that's the real concern for our militaries, I think. It will cause also competition for essential resources and aggravate those. Consider if you want to do, let's say in the Sun Belt area or in other regions, electrolysis, you need clean water. If you do that in the Sun Belt region of North Africa, that will create a significant competition. And that also will lead to protection of installations and the need for it, also cyber, and the transport infrastructure. I give you just 3 examples of how that will shift, at least in the European theater, the strategic thinking. If you go for intermediate storage of electricity on a large scale, one option we have already in Scandinavia. Scandinavia uses its dams to some degree to buffer the electric grid in Europe, now by electric power lines going back and forth. And so that's a big intermediate storage. That means hydro storage in Scandinavia is an issue already for Europe. And military depends on the civil grids. Another big topic will be, for example, geothermal energy. If we really go for that, then the focus will probably go on areas like Iceland And Iceland also has to transport one or the other form of renewable energy to the consumers. And that means there is a new security issue for the military. And then, of course, the big player probably for the foreseeable future will be the development of solar energy production and ultimately hydrogen or electricity production in the Mediterranean and North African region, in the Sun Belt. And that means that the southern flank of NATO will be the soft underbelly if it comes to energy. So these are indirect effects, of course, of climate change. And if you now put on top the problem of migration pressure and so on in the same MENA region, you know that that might be a new and significant challenge which arises from this shift to renewable energy. What can be done by the military at this point? A lot of proposals have been already presented. I think what's important is that military has to address two immediate challenges. They are indirectly arising from climate change, and they can be addressed at this point already. The one is to plan and prepare for protecting emerging critical energy infrastructures, as pointed out, and assure energy supply security from those areas. These are huge industrial plants and huge areas which will be needed for renewable energy production. Let's not confuse ourselves about that point. And that means also that we have to ensure in NATO and in the military that we have qualified personnel for handling these new technologies in time. And we have also especially the resources we need for training those people. So that can be dealt with already to some degree. So stay on top of the technological innovation process because it's not clear yet where we go and to what kind of renewable source we will go. That will be driven by forces outside of the military and outside of NATO. And plan for adaptation and mitigation procedures, that's the other thing, to known and likely challenges to improve the resilience already if we have to deal with these new energies, and also prepare your people for unexpected developments, political and technological paradigm shifts, which might be in the back. And this ultimately comes back to the point I wanted to drive today, which is have well-informed and well-trained personnel in NATO armed forces so that they can be aware of the challenges ahead. I think that's important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reiner, for this pessimistic, I would say pessimistic, but because we like you here at the center, I would say realistic view to what is happening here and what military is facing with this kind of change in both in energy and on top of that the climate change. So in just a few sentences, so is it even realistic and practical and even theoretically possible for the military in the short term to really address the issues of the climate change, or rather this is kind of long-term planning and preparation process for the military? What is your opinion?
Well, in terms of dealing with climate change related impacts, the military is in the midst of it already. No question about that. But I think what is important for the planners and the strategic groups, that it's not yet clear in which areas and what kind of energy we will have to deal with. And so NATO has to be quite open for these developments. It's not clear whether we go nitrogen fuels, which are carbon free, or whether we go hydrogen technology and develop a hydrogen grid. It's not clear whether we go for full electrification because it has its limits for air travel and mobility for heavy instrumentation, or whether we go even for nuclear devices, small nuclear devices. It's totally open at this point, and changes in infrastructure are gonna happen. It's not clear which way will turn out the way which is economically feasible. The hype about synthetic fuels is great. It seems to be a good solution at this point, but it's a drop in fuel. We don't have to worry about that. It costs just 4 times as much, even if we produce it in a large scale in the next decade. So don't worry about that. My personal view is the military shouldn't worry too much about what fuel to use in the next few years, because I think they are okay from an operational point of view with what they have. That's a very conservative point of view, I think, but that's going to happen. But they have to be open what the new developments in infrastructure will bring onto the platter. I think that's the important point. And what we can do right now is get the best educated and best awareness with the military in all ranks from bottom to top, so that they are prepared for the technological challenges as soon as they are received by the military. Industry will produce new ways, new propulsion techniques, and lead the way in that. And military defense industry will provide us with cutting edge technologies, but deal with it when it comes. That's my point of view. But prepare and plan for what you see right now as the challenges. That's my point.
Thank you, Reiner, for these good wishes. Be prepared for everything, for unknown in the future, okay? Like space track. I don't know how many trackies there are in the audience, but let's switch now to General Schonewille. And I understand, General, you are a practitioner. You know where the Dutch military stands now in terms of the energy efficiency and maybe climate change. So it would be very interesting to hear from you, General.
Okay, thanks. What I did was prepare a short presentation. I will share that in a moment. My boss, Lieutenant General Martin Reiner, Chief of the Army, he asked me to really look into this topic to help the Army and their defense to make steps forward. Now, first, let me thank you for the opportunity to speak at this moment. My background is, as you said, logistician. You could say operational and a technical background. And from that, I can combine the two things, as already mentioned by the 3 previous speakers. As you know, 2/3 of the Netherlands is below sea level, 2/3. So we are really on to climate and what's happening at the moment. But okay, and still, we're helping a lot of people all over the world solving those kinds of problems. Okay, now let me share the presentation. See if it works. Okay, I have a couple of slides and I'll use them to address a couple of points. Really interesting hearing the previous speakers. I will come into points they mentioned already. So there's on some points we disagree, I think, and on some points it gave me really a good extra insight in the problem. So let me go to the next slide. Okay. As I said here at Schonewille, I'm responsible for 3 big areas. And why I'm telling this is because the topics we are talking about are crossover. It's not only about material, which I'm responsible for, all land-based material within the Army. Secondly, I'm responsible for all things on the level of C4I. And the third area where I'm responsible is in the area of infrastructure and facility. And I think that all 3 areas are connected if you look towards sustainability. And the other thing is doing things at home are really connected to things we do in a mission area. And you can prepare for a lot of things before going into a mission. What we made in the Netherlands was a short overview. This kind of pictures help to explain things to people. And on the left corner, you see the main tasks where we talk about. And I want to use those main tasks because they are the starting point for the analysis, what to do to be prepared. And you see there from left to right, the standard things, what we do in Nato, what we do in missions, but also what we do at home. And from that point, I like to start my presentation, and then later on I go to the first 2 tasks. if you look to what here is on the picture, what you see is a couple of targets. We all know them. In the middle, approach and starting points, where we say, okay, operational edit, because everything what we do should make us stronger or better prepared. So from that point, we are looking towards a solution. And it's driven by innovation. As Reiner said, you have to be on top or on everything technology that is developed at the moment, but also push it forward. So not leaning back, but even from a military point, as Sherri said, be involved in everything that is going on in institutes where they do all kinds of research. Now, the domains which I'm talking about, and that's the crossover I meant, it's not only about materials, military materials or camps, it's everything, including critical infrastructure in the Netherlands. And the base should be in order to go before you go out. Okay, how are we going to do that? That's what I already said, embedding sustainability in what we do every day, working together with industry, that's the third point. And already mentioned, yeah, make sure you have the right people with the right knowledge. Yeah, I would put something before that. It's what have people in mind, a mindset. There are a lot of people still thinking, there's nothing wrong there, the sea level won't rise, it's not that big problem, it will get over it. Now, we have to change the mindset within and outside the army, that people are really going to think, what can I add towards that, what seems to be becoming a bigger and bigger problem. Okay, let me look if I have everything addressed. Yes, I did. Next slide is my boss, Lieutenant Reiner, says he has 3 focus points. He says we have to be robust, must I say. We have to look from a total force perspective. We can't do it alone. We need every other party, other nations, but also industry, local governments, and supporting Dutch sustainability society is the third one he's putting forward as a focus point. And the reason is because he says the military, they have to help to make it possible that we get to the goals in 2035 and 2050. So not only focused on missions and what we are tasked to, but we should also contribute to the things we should be doing in the Netherlands as well. Okay. Next slide is, now if I look to the barracks where I'm now working at, the headquarters of the army, that's the Komhout Kazerne, that's a barracks, very modern, even with storage of energy. All things that are mentioned. The only thing we don't have here is that we put the energy of solar panels towards hydrogen and store that. But all the other things are in place on this barracks, but only this barrack. We have a lot of infrastructure, 11,000 old buildings, which also add to the problem. So that's a huge challenge to make steps there. So that's a defense challenge at home. So now more about home. You could say this is an overview what we think as a kind of vision, what we should do together. What you see in the center is a base. A base becomes an energy hub. That's our concept. We say at home we should come into a situation where we have a situation that the barracks where we work and the surrounding areas where our villages, we should work together in creating a solution. When something is going wrong with the critical infrastructure, we must be able in that area to sustain electricity, for instance, or heat for at least 72 hours. So this is in the Netherlands. And at the same time, if we go out into a mission, we want the same thing there. So being self-provisioning in that area. So this is the concept we are trying to achieve. And if I take a couple of things out of the picture, there's one of, I put an arrow up there and say MOD should be, and Reiner and I are really disagreeing, I think that defense organization should be a front runner. Within the defense, we develop a lot of solutions, and we have to provide a couple of solutions that make it able to the third task, as I said, there's the things that we should do in the Netherlands or within a base. We must be able to do so, and for that we need a lot of extra technology. And in our opinion, we should be the front runner. And as Sherri said, use the buying power of the defense organization. Use the knowledge, use the flexibility, use the way we look towards logistics. So there's a lot of force inside the army, and to be able to do it now and in the future, we have to really think every time again, this is our task, how are we able to do so? And what do we need for that? And then go to the politics and say, okay, this is what we came up, and for that we need money. So really being a pusher. The third thing is being part of a national network of local energy storage. So you could say MOD as a partner in buffering energy within the Netherlands. A small country, but also in the Netherlands we have to buffer energy towards a slowly a transition towards more using electricity. And the net is not able to provide that. So that's something what we need. The left side under, we have to work closely together with industry, where we say there's no need that we own all the capabilities ourselves. So really working together with other parties and even with other countries. And yeah, that's a little bit what this picture is telling. So base becomes an energy hub. That's what we think. You can say, okay, that's infrastructure and that's that area. But we are convinced that the area of mobility, so all our vehicles play a huge role in combination with the infrastructure. For instance, for buffering energy. If we are able to buffer energy at home, in the base where we work, then we are also able to buffer it when we're out in a mission. So you could say train as you fight or another verse of that. But if we are able to do it at home, and we are able to organize it at home, then we are also able to bring it into mission, but also to other countries. And that's the more humanitarian part. Okay. So that's our vision. Now, that's you could say, okay, nice plans, and what are we really doing? So now I'm shifting to more what we're doing at the moment to achieve those goals. Besides all kinds of big infra projects, the 11,000 buildings I was talking about, we put all those things there in place as we go along with the project, using the money that's already in projects. So not finding new money, but using it, what we already have. And what you see here is that the first two tasks I previously spoke about, so more away from home, there we work together with different kind of parties. And so learning for civil companies, research institutes in a short cycle. So we created an area in the Netherlands, in the neighborhood of Ede, of perhaps some of you know what that area is, the central part of the Netherlands. We created an entire area where we are experimenting with all the things we think that we can use or combine or put into place. So from a CD&E point of view, you could say, a concept development and experimentation. Now, what I put on the right upper part, energy independence at every tier level. That's what I mentioned about doing things at home or in the field, or even if a unit is somewhere for a couple of days. So the tier approach using to put in our concept. So this is more a conceptual picture where we put you could say the base in the center. What you see is that you need energy for a lot of different things call it C4I or cleaning or storage or transport, all kinds of things. So this is a conceptual way of looking at it. And we are looking to what, so we have different functions, different demands, different sources, wind, solar, and all that kind of things. How should we combine that? So that's the smart grid thing. And what kind of effects do we want to achieve? Now, there are a lot of examples we're doing at the moment. I can mention a couple of them. The left, you see a kind of tower, the colored one. That's a combined thing of wind, solar energy, producing hydrogen and storage. So an energy tower, you could say. This is a wheel where we store energy. Tents where we put solar panels on it, and also for PVT, so for heat. We're using vehicles, dual loading. And so we load the Fennec so you can drive. It's a reconnaissance vehicle. But when it's on base, we use it as an energy storage. Using wind energy, a kite surfer, that delivers a huge amount of energy when you have that in the air. So all kinds, energy to waste or folded solar panels. So we are looking to all kinds of technologies and trying to find out what we should put in place. Okay. Experimenting. So if I go to the opportunities, now, what you can see there is we see the opportunities on a bright scale. It is, I think that the fact that we're getting into bigger and bigger problems in the area of energy drives renewing in the area of material that we use. So we see it as, at the same time as an opportunity. The second thing, we doing all these experiments in the Netherlands or also in bases outside the country creates an enormous insight in what we're doing and what we should put in place to get to a kind of being totally independent from surroundings around us and creating the energy we need ourselves. Monitoring, the opportunity is monitoring energy use. We really don't know exactly who is needing what amount of energy at what moment. So the dynamics of that process, that's something we are looking at. So we know, so we are getting an insight how to create the smart grid, as Reiner already mentioned. Now, train as you fight, that's what I meant. Do it at home as the way you would like to do it in the mission as well. Now, the last slide, and that's my ending, and it's really a combination of all the things I said. The mindset of people, that's the most important. Mindset and budget, that are the two big things. Mindset, start thinking in tier 1 or 2 up to 4, not only on infrastructure, but also mobility and the combination of those two. If we go out, it must be possible that a soldier with all kinds of stuff around him, which are working on electricity, comes into a camp, for instance, of the UK or other nations, and is able to load his devices at that moment. The third thing is procurement conditions. I have a lot of projects, and I'm talking to all those people. So how are you going to do? How are you adding to the transition of energy, where the problems we are encountered? So also a mindset thing. Now, knowledge exchange is already mentioned, and ownership and co-ownership. That's something. Yeah, you could lean on others. That's what we're telling here. Okay. So in an overview, the presentation, where we think that you should look. You should look at the entire problem from a conceptual point of view, absolutely, but also from a pragmatic point of view. There's a lot of technology in place already, and we're from the point of view basing, we're looking to infrastructure and mobility and finding solutions for the problem that we already know and that probably will arise. So being more independent. Okay, so far my presentation. A quick overview. Thanks. The floor is back to you.
Thank you, General. Very impressive strategy, but most impressively looks the very structured implementation already of what you have achieved in the Netherlands. I wish Netherlands would decide to join NATO Energy Security Center of Excellence, so we can all benefit from your experience. But listen, if you don't mind, and I noticed, you know, you want to take leadership. At least you pointed I calculated 4 arrows in the 4 different kind of areas, and that's very commendable. And I saw also, which applies to many of European militaries, about CO2 emissions. You know, that's a very practical question to satisfy my own interest. In many militaries, in many countries in Europe, military still have kind of exemption from the CO2 regulations. You know, and in some countries, militaries are very concerned of the investment it would require to, if decision would be made that even military vehicles should satisfy CO2 emission requirements that's set by Europe. I was wondering, in Netherlands, do you have this problem, or this is already solved or even being approached somehow?
Yes and no. There's no demand that we shift to less CO2 towards our military vehicles. We just bought Scania drivers, a big fleet, and they are still working on diesel. But at the same time, every new project, we say, okay, let's look into it. For instance, the internal transport in the Netherlands, fork, truck, lift, for instance, that's something you use also inside buildings, and there they have said that's not allowed anymore. So we're shifting towards electric fork half trucks, but even also in combination with hydrogen, because at shifting towards using less fossil fuel, it brings other problems. For instance, towards under the ground infrastructure. If you use a lot of electro devices, somewhere you get into other problems. So at the same time, you have to look into it as a total concept. So all those things we put in place as we, for instance, build a new barracks. But you can do it in the corner. You have to look to the entire picture. So CO2 is not a demand. But we just talked this morning with the people that delivered us Scania. And would it be possible to do something with the fuel and use biodiesel, for instance, and say 20 or 30%? And then that way, adding, what we say, adding towards, not to our missions, but helping our governments to achieve the 2035, 2050. With not really an operational benefit, because it makes it everything difficult, but then adding it that way. So, is that the answer to your question?
Exactly. That's exactly the answer I was hoping to hear, that there is a prospect and there is a way to do it if needed, but we have to be realistic and understand what we have achieved, what we can achieve in this moment. Thank you again, General, for this practical approach. And finally, do we still have General Nugee online?
We do indeed.
General, I've learned from your bio that you recently retired, but I see you in full military outfit, and unless we caught you on the way to hunting trip or something is not right here, you know. So we'll be happy to hear from you, really. Thank you for being with us here.
Thank you, and again, apologies for both being late and being in my car at the top of a hill. The reason is because, and the reason I'm in uniform is because I was opening our latest buildings, which are net carbon negative. So it shows, I think, that we can be innovators, we can be right at the forefront. These buildings are the second generation of net negative buildings that we've built, with a third less embedded carbon in them. On build. It took 9 weeks of a modular build to put them in, and they are the most fantastic buildings, which are generating more electricity than they are using on a daily basis. And actually that extra electricity will be used for the rest of the camp. And this is something that we're slowly rolling out across our training estate at this point to try and make sure that we have as good buildings as we possibly can. These have been picked up now by the Department of Health and Social Care, by the Department of Education, and they're changing their rules as a direct result of the innovation that we're doing in these buildings. So we can be right at the forefront of technology, reducing the amount of concrete, reducing the amount of energy needed, increasing actually the luxury of the buildings at the same time. So increasing the lived experience, and I might just come back to that. But that's why I'm in uniform, and that's why I'm on the top of a hill in the middle of nowhere. But there we go. Thank you for allowing me to speak, and I've heard some fantastic talks, and some of what I say will, as Reiner said, will be repetition, because I think many people are thinking in the same way. But I wanted to particularly tackle climate change and energy security, and in a sense, I want to rephrase something that President Clinton said a long time ago. When he said it's all about the economy stupid, I would say it's all about energy stupid. We need to understand the energy concepts from a military perspective and from a military operational perspective in a way that is both valuable to the international community and to the non-military community in the way that Sherri was talking. Where's the next innovation? I think some of it could come from this space. But I think that what has not been said so far, perhaps because everybody just understands it, but is worth saying, is we're going through the energy transition, what I would call the green energy revolution, which is for the first time in over 100 years, when we are moving away from a single source of energy, which is a fossil fuel oil or to a certain extent gas, if you take nuclear out of it, into a multipolarity of energies. It could be wind, it could be solar, it could be nuclear, it could be hydrogen, it could be ammonia, it could be a whole load of things. And Reiner made the point very carefully that actually we don't know which of those is going to be the dominant one. I would argue that we're not looking necessarily for a dominant energy source. We're looking for harnessing the best available energy for the tasks that it has to do. And that's fundamentally different because we've had a fallback for the last 100-odd years. We're going to be in a fundamentally different place where we don't know what the best energy is. It will emerge, I'm absolutely sure, in the next 10 to 15 years. What is the best energy for propelling ships through the sea? What is the best energy for aircraft? And is there different energies for different types of aircraft? Almost inevitably there will be, according to the air industry, with some form of hydrocarbon fuel for long distance and perhaps electric for short distance. We're talking about a very different landscape where the energy is not a given, and we have to work it out, and we have to be able to adapt to General Schonewille's point. We have to be able to adapt as fast as possible to the way that the industry is going, and we have to lead some of that adaptation. But actually, I am a massive optimist, and forgive me, Reiner, I'm an optimist, but also I hope a realist, in that I remember when I was being brought up in the 1970s, the consensus was we would run out of oil by 2020. We haven't. And in fact, we're finding more oil. What does that say? I think that there is a possibility, a genuine probability, that we will find energy solutions that will allow the military to operate in a carbon-free or a carbon-reduced environment. And whilst I would say that every military ought to be able to get to net zero by 2050, it is reliant on having a residual emission from some of our equipment and not from others, and trying to change. We change in the UK about 25% of our equipment every 10 years. So in the next 30 years, we're only going to change 75% of our equipment. What does that mean? Our aircraft carriers, which we didn't build with nuclear engines, we built with diesel engines, they're still going to be around in 2050, 2060. We might be able to do carbon capture for some of the emissions from those aircraft carriers, but they're still going to emit. And we're not going to change the engines on them in order to hit a carbon target, I suggest, because it would be prohibitively expensive for the MOD to do so unless we were ordered to do so by government, and then we'd expect them to pay. And therefore, we are going to have some residual, But what we've got to do is use every opportunity, therefore, to minimize our emissions over the next 30 years. So I think energy transition from the single to the multiple offers huge opportunities, and you've heard about some of those already, but also some threats. And I want to go through those briefly. But before I do, we should be in no doubt, and this has been said, but it's worth repeating, particularly to non-military people who aren't perhaps following this as closely. We have a single purpose, and that purpose is to defend our nation and protect our citizens. There will be no prizes for coming second in a war just because we are the greener army or the greener navy or the greener air force. We have to be able to do our primary role, which is to defend our citizens and our countries, and that this green energy transition must therefore, we must find a way that enhances and makes better our operational capability, not diminishes it. This is not what I call a zero-sum game. It's not either or. It is that we have to find the ways, and I believe we can, to enhance our operational capability at the same time as embracing green technology. And you got that in one of the slides that General Schonewille showed, something that we've done, hybrid jackals. Jackal is a type of armored vehicle. We can run it on batteries so that when you're in reconnaissance mode, as was said, it is silent, it's not giving off any noise emission, it's not giving off any vehicle gas emission, and it's not giving off any heat emission. It is a better vehicle for a military capability. That's what we should be concentrating on. It will also force, I believe, a change in mindset, and I completely agree again, this is about mindset, in the way that we field new equipment. So why not take the person out of the vehicle more often? I'm not talking about autonomous vehicles. I'm not necessarily even talking about semi-autonomous, but remote control. If you do that with a tank, say, instead of a 70-ton NATO tank, you might get down to a 20-ton tank because it is much smaller and it is much lighter because you don't have the armor on it. And therefore, it makes it susceptible to a green energy solution. I would argue a 70-ton tank is not susceptible to a green energy solution, not as we have technology today, and which has still got a 300-kilometer range and can be refueled in 5 minutes or 7 minutes, which a tank demands today. We won't be able to do that with a green energy solution as presented today, whatever the cost. So we've got to think differently about how we field equipment. But there is opportunity to improve our operational capability. There is opportunity to be self-sufficient, both domestic, which, and again, I would slightly disagree with Reiner and turn around and say that actually what we should be doing is making our domestic bases as resilient and as energy self-sufficient as possible. So we're not reliant on the electric grid. So in the camp that I've been at today, in time, all the buildings will be self-sufficient. We're off the grid. With battery storage, we're off the grid the whole time. I'm a massive keen fan, and I've been encouraging the MOD military to look at hydro power because it's 24 hours a day and that it isn't reliant on good weather. And so what we're looking at is trying to take our camps off the grid so we're resilient and actually we're self-sufficient. And every military force really ought to be self-sufficient. So it's both domestic, which actually reduces cost, but it's also in the deployed space. And Sherri referred to the logistic train. It's the sad fact, as I understand it, that the US Army lost 2,000 to 3,000 troops in their logistic trains in Iraq and Afghanistan. For Britain, the most senior officer killed in Afghanistan was on a logistic resupply. So if we can minimize that by becoming more self-sufficient, that is effective. It has the byproduct. I'm ashamed to say that in Camp Bastion, we had diesel generators. We should have had solar panels. We left those diesel generators as a gift to the Afghan army when we left. We thought we were doing them a favor. The reality is we left them with a legacy of requiring spare parts, requiring training, and requiring energy. All that could have been avoided if we'd left them solar panels instead, which would have been a much better outcome for them. So we have the opportunity to support the people we're trying to support, even when we've left, if we use green energy. The other point, beyond operational effectiveness, is simulation. If we can use a mindset which talks about simulation more, then actually we will reduce our energy bills, we'll reduce our energy emissions from flying fast jets, for example, but also there's more operational capability there because we can do things in simulators that we don't want to show our adversaries that we can have the capability of doing. And of course, we talked about mitigation. It gives us the opportunity, new technology gives us the opportunity to rethink, but also to reduce our emissions. And that must be something that we are trying to do. But there are threats. There are threats from the energy security piece. And some of this has been touched on already. At the global level, there's the geopolitical, what I call tectonic shifts. I would argue that a part of the campaigns in the Second World War were designed to protect oil supplies. In other words, we went to war to protect, or at least we executed parts of that war to protect oil supplies, whether it was the Nazis, whether it was us, whoever it was about oil supplies and protecting them. That will diminish if we remove fossil fuels, but we will be into the different geopolitical positions of rare earths. We need to understand that. I don't think we understand that yet. We don't understand what alliances will be built. We don't understand what alliances will be broken. But what we do know is that as countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels reduce their dependency, or more importantly, have that income reduced because we buy less fossil fuels, it will push them into a corner where they have little choice. And those are dangerous positions. We know that if we push countries into corners and we start to reduce their GDP substantially, they have the ability and often the will to lash out at neighboring countries. We need to understand that, the potential for that, and look to see what is the impact of this energy transition away from fossil fuels and the countries that are dependent on the income from that, and towards rare earths and the protection of that, which has already been mentioned. So we need to diversify, those countries need to diversify. We need to allow them to diversify, but at the same time, we need to move away from fossil fuels as fast as possible. That is a conundrum that the world has not yet come to a conclusion on, and I think the militaries should be absolutely aware of where we're going with that. At the local level, Reiner made it really clear, and I would completely agree, it's about the unpredictability, and that brings cost. So what it also brings is a different relationship with industry, and it was mentioned again. We need to be an agile partner with industry as they develop their innovation, rather than being the recipient or the requirer of particular equipment. The way that I positioned this to the Royal Navy was to turn around and say, usually when you design a ship, the first thing you design is the propulsion system. I'm asking you for that to be the last thing to be designed, because by the time it's come off the drawing board, we will have a different propulsion system probably, which you will want to embrace because technology is moving so fast. That takes a different mindset. It takes a different opportunity. But looking at the buildings I opened today, I said one thing at the first generation, which is reduce the embedded carbon, please, because I'm not satisfied with the embedded carbon you're putting into the buildings, despite the fact that they're net zero buildings of use. The industry went away, the contractor went away, he's reduced it by a third just because of my comment. And he made a point of saying it was because of my comment. It's possible if you give people the opportunity. And by actually reducing the embedded carbon, he reduced the amount of concrete, he could reinvest that money and make the rest of the building better. This is the sort of thing we need from industry, an agile, developmental and dedicated R&D that we take advantage of. There is an issue here, one of the threats, and it's been mentioned, but I think it's really worth stressing. We need to be interoperable. NATO, above all, needs to be interoperable. The single fuels policy is going to come under immense pressure as a result of the green energy transition. And as a result, we need to understand it, and we need to work together as an alliance really clearly to make sure that whatever energy solutions are available, we adopt as an alliance. It was the head of the Norwegian Navy who turned around to me and said, there's no point in me having a different fuel type if when I come to a UK port, I cannot use your fuel. So we've got to, at the heart of NATO, we've become interoperable. We need to maintain that. There will be concerns and threats over vulnerabilities and consistency of supply, whether it's the supply of green earth, whether it's supply of energy if we're not off the grid. There is one prediction I have seen, and I haven't verified it, so it may not be true, but if 30% of the UK goes to electric vehicles, we will run out of electricity with our current electrical supplies. We need to understand that, and we need to make sure that we have sufficient.
Yeah.
We also need to build the energy transition into our planning and scenario setting. What does it mean for how we deploy? What does it mean for where we deploy? What does it mean for when we deploy? We need to start planning that. We need to build it into our scenarios. We need to build it into our exercises so that it becomes a key part of what we're doing rather than just a theoretical. And then briefly, it's not all about energy. It's about the effect of climate change on livelihoods. Sherri mentioned the increase in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, mentioned the military assistance to civil authorities, the potential for failing crops and floods, and shortages with displaced persons and tensions from migration. All of that is true. NATO, above all, should be horizon scanning across the world to work out what it is going to do about these potential threats. What's the solution? The solution cannot only be military. And here the military needs to take a back step from being in the lead and say, we need to work with the development agencies. We need to work with our foreign offices and our diplomacy in order to make sure that it is as we call it, a 3D, a defense, diplomacy, and development approach to making sure that actually we get the best out of the green energy transition, but also to reduce the threats. Climate change, the change in environment, is as relevant to the military as it has ever been. And I'm reminded I noticed that Napoleon died 200 years ago, I think yesterday, and the French commemorated the death of Napoleon. In 1815 at Waterloo, he delayed his attack because of rain and because of the environment. This is nothing new. We've been doing this for 200 years. We just need to understand it more because it is changing at a level that we haven't experienced before. It will bring geopolitical, it will bring security, it will bring energy, and it will bring climatic changes. But we've got to work within the environment we know and which we can predict, and that means we need to understand it. And I think militaries, more than anybody, really need to understand that if we're to be effective in the future. Romualdas, I'll stop there.
Thank you, General. Very, very impressive, and thank you for your optimism, because this sounds very promising and very good. But still, and for this, you know, understanding and kind of diving deep into this green transition, which probably will be challenging, but as you said, will provide military with the level of flexibility. But also what caught my attention, you said, you know, that in future, some of our weapon systems will still be here that are kind of probably backwards compatible, and your expression, I didn't capture it totally, but you say if new capabilities are required, they should, if somebody asks for the new capabilities, they should pay. And by they, I understand it's our, in some kind, political masters. Are you sure that they are ready to pay? How do we present our case as a military? Because it has to happen now if we want to have something in the future.
So in the UK, the government has put aside money specifically for central government departments in order to make them more emission reduced. And we need to take advantage of that. So there is money there. We are part of the nation. We're not separate to the nation when we're domestically deployed or when we're domestically living at home. We're part of the nation, and we should take advantage that the government is going to, in my view, the government is going to have to subsidize some of the things we do. If you look at heat pumps, for example, and heating our houses as a nation is one of the biggest problems that we have in this country, and I'm sure it's the same in other countries in Europe. At transport, you can do something about reasonably quickly, and there will be a shift, I believe, to rail instead of air. You're seeing that in France already, to EV cars, potentially hydrogen cars. I personally don't think that'll come about, but you're beginning to see a shift already. Heating houses is a fundamentally different problem. The government will have to subsidize that or we won't meet our targets, in my view. And the government, I think, recognizes that. We in defense need to take advantage of that as well. So we're not separate from the rest of society in that case when we're dealing with our own thing. Where we are separate from society, of course, is in our deployed space. And there I would expect the Ministry of Defense budget to be able to have to pay for it.
Very good, thank you very much. And this understanding that military is a part of society, it's very important, because Reiner talked briefly about the study we did with Australian forces, and it appeared to us somehow that Australian government in some cases asked military for too much, not respecting the military as a part of the society in terms of being kind of energy efficient and very provisional. I see a few questions here from the audience, but we are running very short on time. And I was reading through the questions, and I hope our audience is satisfied with the answers they could deduce from the presentations, because there is a question about future of with shortage of rare earth materials, and that's very topical issue, really, because we probably all witnessed just a couple of months maybe ago the referendum in Greenland, where there is a deposit of rare earth materials, and there were willing and able countries and companies to exploit those, but referendum was negative. So we're still relying on the rare earth materials that are mostly with our kind of peer competitor, as we call this in China. So how we can address this in the future? Should we be worried in the military about those questions? Maybe General Schonewille, do you have any opinion on that? Is this something you feel that there is a shortage of technology that might be using rare earth materials, or this is still in the future?
Well, yeah, I think if you keep on thinking the old way, you will never go to the new ways. That's what I want to say. If you really look towards fossil and that kind of stuff, if you really keep going into that area, but as I understood is there's recently they produced a huge machine they put in the sea, where there's a lot of energy in the sea, in streaming. So there's a lot of energy in wind and in solar and all other possibilities that we really have to shift towards that. So there's the heat in the earth and the wind. So I think there's a lot of energy, but harnessing it and transforming it in usable energy for homes or vehicles, that's the trick. I think the technology is there, but the mindset and the budget, as I said before, you have to have the mindset to make those kind of steps. Everyone. Okay.
That's clear. We have to be ahead on our research. And I like the comment General Nugee just mentioned about interoperability. And one of the key elements and values of NATO for the nations was this kind of push for interoperability. So General Polomé, are you still with us somewhere? I don't see you on the screen.
Yes, I am, but my video for some reason is disabled.
Okay, it's probably because of the bandwidth. So is NATO prepared to kind of lead with the interoperability requirements when the nations are ready to introduce those new kind of maybe energy saving or energy efficient technologies.
Romualdas, in NATO, we set interoperability as the criteria #1. So innovation is important, is brought into the organization, but still the interoperability remains a condition for requirements, for new capabilities. So I'm not too much afraid. Yes, there will be initiatives made by nations and so on, but once it will go in the pool of force, as we have discussed in the NDPP process, you know, the interoperability will be part of the requirement too. So forces that are disconnected from the rest, that cannot be resupplied, sustained, we check the survivability as well, they will be rejected as a solution for the NATO pool of force. So again, you know, nations have got their own national missions, their own national supply chain, and they decide what they do on their side. But towards NATO, this is the best answer I can give you, and it should be reassuring.
Very good, thank you. And that's a promising answer, actually. And during your presentation, you mentioned a few NATO strategic documents where the either energy security and climate change will be addressed. So that's important for the nations to know that the organization like NATO is a kind of forward-looking organization in those new challenges. Sherri, you have listened, you know, through those presentations. Are you still with this idea that we need domain for the climate change and maybe energy efficiency? Should really military be in this forefront of the maybe this even I would say green transition? Are you maintaining this position?
Absolutely, and I think it's going to help improve military effectiveness and our warfighting capability, and it's going to enable militaries to continue to be trusted institutions in their societies in the future. I really want to commend, well, all the speakers, but I see that General Schonewille and General Nugee are really leading in their own individual nations and within NATO in enabling the energy transition we need for improved military effectiveness. And those, you know, militaries are very used to having a performance goal set, a target set, and then achieving it. So as General Schonewille said, he showed us a figure of 70%, I think, reduction in carbon emissions in military bases over 2050. And if we get targets, we can begin to achieve those. For example, the U.S. military over the last few years, as a result of being overly dependent on a aging electric grid in the U.S. and Reiner well pointed out that the vulnerabilities to military bases of being subject to an electric grid that they are not responsible for, has moved to island its bases and being able to operate even if the power goes down off base for a certain period of time. 2 weeks has been the standard so far. Now, that can be achieved either with or without moving towards green energy, okay? In the last administration in the US, that islanding for 2 weeks was a performance target, but moving towards green energy was not. We can have that same performance target of green, you know, of being able to operate off the grid with microgrids and driving innovation in grid, in electrification technology and grid and transmission infrastructure that needs to be updated in all of our countries, and at the same time addressing these challenges. I think the big one on rare earths and that supply chain, obviously that's a big challenge, but I think the innovation and the need for it in the military will help drive that innovation as it has done, because the science and technology infrastructure, the labs, the universities that support our militaries throughout each of our societies are the engines of innovation of society. And so we need to take advantage of that. And that will help us build what I call both climate domain awareness, as well as use the buying power of our military to aid the green transition.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's that's very interesting, and again, very optimistic. I'm getting this optimistic vibe from this panel, so I have to give a word to Reiner to try to correct himself and be more optimistic. And I have one question here, and the listener is right. You know, some technologies that are required for the military are very military specific. And if we try to make them more energy efficient, it first will be costly, and then might even reduce at certain times combat capabilities. So Reiner, how do we approach that? How do you approach in your research division how you are looking in those new technologies?
Nothing wrong with new technologies. In the contrary, I fully agree that we have to be on the forefront, and the military has to push for that. However, the topic of our 4 symposia is climate change and energy security issues in NATO Armed Forces sphere. And that means what I was making as a point was not talking about one little segment, which is overly covered here, which is basically mitigation efforts, decarbonization. What I try to point out, and I think Mr. Nugee got it very well, thank you for spelling it out, was when it comes push to shove, now and in the next decade or 2, we have to also consider that we are resilient to threats, and that does not necessarily include that we jump on every new energy bandwagon at this point with our forces. I'm fully for research, we do that, we publish on these new technologies and the pros and cons. But let's keep in mind, if it comes push to shove, NATO has to perform defense and not basically be a playground for decarbonization. That is great if we do it. That gives us a wonderful appearance in public, and it's definitely a political mandatory issue for us. Let's observe that. But the topic was really, what does climate change to us? Security in terms of security issues, and that's what I try to point out, and that's why I make all these caveats, and I think that was also touched on by the others. It's great what everybody does in the armed forces, no objections to that, experimentation and everything, but let's keep a sober view on performance, and as long as we are compromising on performance, we should be very careful in adopting new technologies. They will come to us and we have to be prepared for it. That was the point I made. It was probably a little bit the devil's advocate, but I think you got the point talking from an old paratrooper.
Thank you, Reiner, very much. That's very clear. And listen, we've been online for more than 2 hours now, and I really thank you, all of you, for participation and for your patience, and for, most importantly, for your great insights. And there is in our chat session one comment referring to General Nugee's presentation that not the greenest army probably wins the war, but the strongest. And let's all understand that we still have to maintain our warfighting capability, and of course look into what the future brings to us, but be cautious and careful in that. So again, thank you very much. Thank you for Fondation for Research Stratégique, our partners from Paris. Nicolas is here with the nice Eiffel Tower in the background. Thank you for putting all this together. Thank you, all of you, for participating. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this session. Please recommend to listen to recordings to your colleagues, because this is the series of seminars that highlights the importance of the climate change and how military approaches it. So thank you very much, and see you in the last seminar. I believe it's 26th of May. Who wants to join us?
27th, Romualdas.
27th.
27th.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.